cold wind howled through the endless pine trees, like ancient spirits whispering secrets to one another. And as the first snow of the season blanketed the forest floor in a shimmering, moonlit white, Thomas Reed, a quiet man in his early 50s, with silver streaks in his beard and sadness heavy in his eyes, sat alone in his old wooden cabin at the edge of Whispering Pines, a forgotten town where every neighbor knew each other's dogs by name, but sometimes forgot each other's birthdays, stirring a pot of soup over the crackling fire, lost in the hollow comfort of routine, until a faint scratching sound broke the silence like a whisper against the door. And with a cautious glance, he rose from his chair, creaking across the wooden floorboards that groaned under his weight, pulling his old denim jacket tighter around himself before opening the door to find a sight so unexpected that he thought for a moment the lonely years had finally birthed hallucinations. There, shivering against the cold and blinking up at him with eyes the color of misty rivers, stood a small, frail wolf pup, no bigger than a house cat, its gray fur matted and thin, tiny ribs visible against its trembling sides, and for a long heartbeat neither moved. Man and wolf pup simply staring at one another under the falling snow. And then the pup, with a fragile whimper that broke whatever icy defenses Thomas had built around his own heart, staggered forward and collapsed against the warmth of his boots. And something in that moment, something ancient and wordless, passed between them, as if the broken pieces of his lonely soul recognized the bruised spirit of the little creature before him. And almost without thinking, Thomas scooped the pup up into his arms, wrapping it inside his jacket, feeling its faint heartbeat against his chest, and brought it inside where the warmth of the fire quickly enveloped them both. And as he carefully inspected the pup, finding small scratches and dried blood, but thankfully no broken bones, he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't leave this animal to the mercy of the wilderness, not when the world had already shown it such cruelty. So he laid down old blankets by the fire, offering the pup a bowl of water and bits of cooked rabbit meat he had hunted earlier that week, and watched with quiet awe as the pup, cautious but too hungry to resist, devoured every bite, its tail twitching in tiny, uncertain wags. And over the next few days, as snowstorms raged and the world outside turned into a frozen kingdom, Thomas and the pup, whom he named Ghost for its pale, spectral eyes, began to forge a bond stronger than anything he had felt in years. Each careful glance and tentative nuzzle carving away the loneliness like a sculptor, freeing a masterpiece from marble. But when the storms finally broke and Thomas decided to take Ghost outside for a little walk around the cabin, bundled in a makeshift sling he fashioned from an old flannel shirt, it didn't take long for the town of Whispering Pines to notice that Thomas, the reclusive widower known for keeping to himself, had taken in what clearly wasn't an ordinary stray dog, but a wolf. And soon neighbors began murmuring at the general store debates flared at the diner, and even Sheriff Dalton knocked on his door one afternoon, boots thudding on the porch, hat in hand, saying things like, "You know, Tom, folks are worried. Wolves are dangerous, wild, unpredictable." But Thomas, with a rare steel in his voice, only replied, "So are people, Sheriff, but we don't put them down just because they're broken." And with that, the sheriff tipped his hat and left, muttering something about keeping an eye out. And Thomas knew it would not be the last he heard of it, especially after Ghost began to grow at an astonishing rate, his once frail frame filling out with muscle and strength, though his eyes remained as soulful and trusting as that first night. And then one evening, just as the first hints of spring began to thaw the frozen rivers, and green shoots of life poked bravely through the snow, a frantic knocking came at Thomas's door, and when he opened it, he found Ellie Patterson, a young woman from town whose father ran the hardware store, her face pale and breathless, clutching a bloodied jacket and sobbing about her little brother, Sam, who had gone missing up by Blackthorn Ridge. And without hesitation, Thomas grabbed his coat and Ghost's makeshift harness, though Ghost was already at his side, ears pricked forward, sensing the urgency, and they followed Ellie up into the forest, where the shadows stretched long and strange under the moon, calling Sam's name. But the only answer was the bitter wind, until suddenly Ghost stiffened, nose in the air, and with a low, urgent whine, began pulling Thomas toward a narrow ravine, hidden behind thick underbrush, where Sam lay trapped, his leg pinned under a fallen log, his small body shivering violently in the cold. And while Thomas worked to free the boy, Ghost stood guard, snarling into the darkness at unseen threats. And when finally they pulled Sam free and carried him back to town, word of Ghost's bravery spread like wildfire, turning fear into admiration, suspicion into awe, and soon Whispering Pines had not only accepted the strange bond between man and wolf, but celebrated it. Neighbors stopping by with treats and toys for Ghost, children asking for pictures, even Sheriff Dalton dropping off a heavy bag of fresh meat with a sheepish, "For the town's little hero." But even as life settled into a new, joyful rhythm, Thomas sometimes wondered about Ghost's origins, about the day he had stumbled onto his porch, as if guided by fate itself. And then one evening, sitting by the fire with Ghost's heavy head resting in his lap, Thomas noticed a faint scar shaped like a crescent moon behind Ghost's left ear, a mark identical to the one Thomas's late wife, Maria, used to sketch in her journal whenever she dreamed of the life they would build, a symbol of hope, a family of second chances. And in that moment, with the crackle of fire and the steady, grounding weight of Ghost's love against him, Thomas understood that sometimes, when the world breaks you apart, the universe sends you not what you expect, but exactly what you need to be whole again. And so, under the eternal glow of the moonlit Muzzle stories that seemed to weave unseen magic through their lives, Thomas and Ghost faced each new day together. A man and a wolf, both once lost, now found. Two kindred spirits bound by an invisible thread stronger than fear, stronger than loneliness, stronger than fate itself. The days melted into each other like colors on a painter's canvas. And with the coming of spring, the forests of whispering pines came alive with a symphony of chirping birds, buzzing bees, and the distant rushing of rivers freed from their icy prisons. Yet, despite the outward peace, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Ghost's arrival had stirred something deeper in the land itself, an ancient energy that had slumbered beneath the soil and now, awakened, whispered on the edges of dreams. And it wasn't just Thomas who noticed it, for the town, once sleepy and routine-bound, began to experience a series of strange events that rippled outward like stones dropped into still water. Starting with Old Man Crenshaw, who swore he saw a white deer with eyes like glass standing at the edge of his cornfield just before his barren land inexplicably bloomed with out-of-season sunflowers. Or little Maybelle Jenkins, who claimed she followed a silvery fox through the woods and stumbled upon a clearing filled with glowing mushrooms that hummed when the wind blew through them. And though the townsfolk mostly laughed these stories off over coffee at Betty's diner, Thomas listened with a gnawing sense of familiarity, because every time he looked into Ghost's misty eyes, he glimpsed not just the reflection of the world around him, but something older, something untamed. And as spring ripened into early summer, he and Ghost ventured further from the cabin, exploring forgotten trails and deep woods where the canopy grew so thick that no sunlight touched the ground. And on one such expedition, following a narrow deer path overgrown with ferns, Ghost suddenly stopped, muscles taut, nose twitching at scents Thomas could not detect. And without hesitation, the wolf pup-turned companion led him through a winding maze of trees until they stumbled upon a clearing Thomas swore had not been there before, at the center of which stood a gnarled old oak tree larger than any he had ever seen, its branches twisting skyward like frozen lightning, its bark etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with an inner light only visible when the sun dipped low. And though he couldn't understand how he knew, Thomas realized this was no ordinary place. It was a crossroads, a place where the threads of past, present, and future braided themselves into invisible patterns. And as Ghost circled the tree, his tail low but wagging, Thomas felt a warmth flood his chest, not unlike the feeling he had the first time he saw Maria smiling shyly across a crowded bookstore all those years ago. A sense of rightness, of coming home to something he never knew he had lost. And in that moment, Thomas sank to his knees and pressed his hand against the roots, feeling a heartbeat deep within the earth itself that matched his own. And though no words were spoken, the meaning was clear. The forest had chosen him, just as Ghost had chosen him, not as a master, but as a steward, a protector. And the weight of that unspoken oath settled on his shoulders with a surprising lightness, as if a burden he had carried for years, without realizing, had finally been set down. But even as he basked in the magic of the moment, a low growl from Ghost snapped him back to the present. And lifting his gaze, Thomas saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes peering at them from the tree line, followed by the lithe, shadowy form of a wolf far larger and darker than Ghost, its fur like burnt smoke, its teeth bared in a silent snarl. And instinctively, Thomas stood and placed himself between Ghost and the stranger, heart pounding in his chest. But Ghost let out a high, keening whine, not of fear, but of recognition. And to Thomas's amazement, the larger wolf stepped cautiously into the clearing, lowering its head in a gesture of submission before sniffing Ghost's nose in a dance of silent communication. And though Thomas could not understand their language, he felt its weight and meaning: family, lost and found, a bond stretching beyond blood and bone. And when the larger wolf turned its golden gaze on Thomas, there was no malice, only an ancient sorrow that resonated deep within him. And as quickly as it had appeared, the dark wolf melted back into the shadows, leaving behind only a single feather caught in the underbrush, black with an iridescent sheen that shimmered with every color of the rainbow when he turned it in his hand. And though he didn't know why, Thomas tucked the feather into the breast pocket of his jacket, feeling its subtle warmth against his heart like a secret talisman. And from that day forward, strange things began happening with more frequency. Animals long thought extinct were glimpsed at the edges of town. Sick trees healed overnight, and people who had given up on old dreams found themselves daring to believe once again. And though no one said it out loud, everyone knew deep down that Ghost had something to do with it, that the little wolf, who had stumbled half dead onto Thomas's porch, had brought with him a kind of living magic that asked for nothing in return but trust. And as summer reached its golden peak, Thomas started hosting evening gatherings around his cabin's fire pit, where townsfolk would bring guitars and harmonicas, stories and laughter, and Ghost would lie at Thomas's feet, his eyes half closed, absorbing the music of human hearts and weaving it into the unseen symphony of the forest itself. And slowly, piece by piece, the town of Whispering Pines was reborn, not through grand gestures or sweeping changes, but through small acts of kindness, bravery, and wonder, sparked by the presence of one lost soul, and one lost wolf who had found each other when they both needed it most. And though Thomas never sought recognition, the legend of the Wolf of Whispering Pines spread far and wide, drawing curious travelers, scholars, and even a few self-proclaimed mystics to their little corner of the world, all hoping to glimpse the magic that had quietly turned a forgotten town into a beacon of hope. But none ever found it by seeking, for the magic lived not in the spectacle, but in the simple, unseen threads that bound hearts together. And it was only those who came with open hands and open hearts who would sometimes, just sometimes, catch a flicker of movement among the trees, a flash of misty silver eyes in the moonlight, and know in their bones that they had been blessed to walk, if only for a moment, in the wake of something truly extraordinary. And through it all, Thomas and Ghost remained side by side, a man and a wolf, growing older, wiser, and ever more attuned to the silent language of the earth and the whispered stories carried on the night winds. And on the rare nights when the town slept soundly and the world held its breath, Thomas would sit on his porch with Ghost's head heavy on his lap, gaze up at the endless stars spinning overhead, and whisper a quiet thank you to whatever unseen force had sent a broken little wolf pup to his door, knowing that in a world too often torn by fear and loneliness, they had found in each other a home, a purpose, and a love as deep and wild as the forests themselves as the seasons shifted once again, and the amber leaves of autumn began to fall like whispers onto the winding trails of whispering pines. Thomas found that the bond between himself and Ghost had grown into something almost telepathic, where no words were needed, and yet entire conversations unfolded in a single glance. And as Ghost grew in size and strength, his coat thickened to a shimmering frost gray in the cooling air, catching the fading sunlight in such a way that townsfolk sometimes paused mid-sentence just to marvel at him, their hearts swelling with a mix of wonder and reverence. Yet even as Ghost flourished, a quiet tension began to simmer beneath the surface of the town, an almost imperceptible shift that made the birds fall silent in the early mornings, and the deer lift their heads sharply from the streams before bounding away with wide, fearful eyes. And Thomas, whose senses had become finely attuned to the forest's moods, felt it too, a gathering storm that had nothing to do with weather, but with something older, something stirring in the marrow of the hills. And it started subtly enough, missing livestock from nearby farms, strange claw marks gouged into trees that even the oldest hunters could not recognize, howls that fractured the night with an eerie, metallic resonance. And though the townsfolk tried to brush it off, chalking it up to a particularly aggressive mountain lion or bear, in their hearts they knew better. And on one particularly cold evening, as Thomas and Ghost sat by the fire pit outside the cabin, the crackling flames painting their faces in shades of gold and crimson, a figure approached from the darkness, a woman, cloaked in a long coat of woven wool, her eyes dark and glinting with an ageless knowledge. And without a word, she sat opposite them, pulling from her satchel an old, weather-beaten map that she spread out between them, the parchment yellowed and fragile, yet the ink still vibrant, depicting not just the land as it was, but as it once had been, and tracing her finger along a line that wound through the forest. She spoke in a voice that was both a whisper and a command. "The old ones are waking," she said, "and with them, the forgotten hunger." And though her meaning was cryptic, Thomas felt a cold certainty settle into his bones, understanding that something ancient and malevolent, long sealed away, was beginning to seep back into the world. And Ghost, too, felt the shift, his ears flattening as he pressed closer to Thomas's side. And the woman, whose name was never offered and never asked, explained that the feather Thomas had found, the iridescent talisman tucked safely inside his jacket, was not merely a token, but a key, a relic tied to the balance between worlds, entrusted to those rare few chosen by the wild itself. And that balance had been disturbed, weakened by generations of human forgetfulness and greed, leaving room for the old darkness to creep back in through the cracks. And so began the great work, a silent battle waged not with swords or guns, but with the fierce, stubborn will to protect, to heal, to remember. And under the woman's guidance, Thomas, Ghost, and a small, unlikely fellowship of townsfolk, farmers, teachers, even teenagers who felt the pull of something larger than themselves, set about fortifying the hidden places of the forest, weaving protections not seen with the eye, but felt in the gut. Songs sung in forgotten tongues, circles of stones and herbs laid under moonlight, prayers whispered into the roots of ancient trees. And through it all, Ghost became more than a companion. He became a sentinel, his presence alone enough to turn back lesser shadows, his howls threading through the night like luminous arrows of defiance and hope. Yet, for all their efforts, the darkness pressed harder, and the first true test came one moonless night when a dense, unnatural fog rolled into whispering pines, muffling sound and blinding even the brightest lanterns. And from that fog emerged creatures twisted by hunger and rage, half-remembered nightmares given flesh, elongated limbs, eyes that shone like coals, teeth too many and too sharp. And though terror gripped his heart, Thomas stood firm, Ghost at his side, and as the first creature lunged, there was a blinding flash of light from the feather in Thomas's jacket, a flare that seared the mist and drove the creature shrieking back into the trees. And understanding dawned like a firestorm in his mind. The key was not just protection, it was power, a bridge between what was and what could be. And tapping into it required not strength of arm, but strength of spirit, of heart. And so, through the long night, they fought, not with violence, but with songs of remembrance, with the steady, unyielding force of love and memory and belonging. And by dawn, the fog had receded, the creatures vanquished, though not destroyed, retreating to nurse their wounds and plot anew. And Thomas, exhausted but alive, knew that this was only the beginning, that the true battle would be fought not in a single clash, but over seasons, years, perhaps lifetimes, and that the cost would be heavy. Yet, when he looked down at Ghost, whose silver eyes gleamed with pride and fierce joy, he also knew he would pay that price 1,000 times over, because this was their home, their pack, their story to defend. And as the sun rose blood-red over the forest, painting the world in a new light, Thomas lifted the feather high, its light blaze out over whispering pines, a beacon of hope and defiance against the coming storm. And though the road ahead would be long and perilous, filled with loss and doubt and moments of near despair, Thomas was no longer afraid, for he had Ghost at his side, the forest at his back, and the love of a town that had finally remembered who it was meant to be. And together, they would weave a new legend, one howl, one heartbeat, one story at a time, beneath the eternal, watchful eyes of the moonand. So as the days lengthened into golden afternoons, and the forest slowly healed from the unseen scars left by the night of the creeping fog, Thomas and Ghost found themselves no longer the silent sentinels of an invisible war, but instead beloved protectors whose quiet courage and steadfast love had reawakened something vital in the hearts of whispering pines, something that could never again be allowed to slip into legend or myth. For there was a renewed reverence for the wild places now, an understanding that the trees and rivers and secret glades were not merely backdrops to human lives, but living, breathing guardians in their own right. And though Thomas sometimes awoke at night to Ghost's low growl at the distant echo of some long-forgotten howl, he no longer feared what lurked in the shadows, for he knew that darkness could be faced, endured, and even, when necessary, forgiven. And over time, the town began to transform in small but meaningful ways. Children learned the old songs and left offerings of berries and woven grasses at the ancient oak at the center of the woods. Farmers rotated their fields with the patience of those who remembered the land's rhythms rather than exploiting them. And hunters became storytellers, weaving the lessons of the wild into the fabric of every gathering. And as for Thomas, he never again lived a life of isolation. For with Ghost at his side, and the friendships forged in fire and fog, he had found a family more real than any he had ever known. And they would often gather at his little cabin, now expanded and sturdier, but still wrapped in the scent of pine and old smoke, sitting around the fire pit beneath the endless stars, sharing meals, laughter, and the kind of quiet companionship that needs no words. And it was during one such night, when the leaves had just begun to hint at the fire they would soon become, that a soft scratching came at the cabin door. And when Thomas rose to answer it, heart lifting with the curiosity of a child, he found not a visitor from town, but a young wolf pup, all gangly legs and bright, trusting eyes, shivering slightly in the crisp air. And Ghost, upon seeing the pup, gave a soft, welcoming bark, nudging the little one inside with his nose, and without hesitation, Thomas knelt and gathered the trembling creature into his arms, feeling its tiny heartbeat thundering against his palm. And as the pup snuggled into his chest with a sigh of pure relief, he realized with a deep, soul-warming certainty that the cycle had come full circle, that he and Ghost had not only protected the old ways, but had become their living embodiment, the bridge between wild and tame, legend and reality. And And as he sat back down by the fire with the pup nestled against him, Ghost on one side and his friends surrounding him, Thomas looked up at the vast, silver-lit sky, feeling a gratitude so profound it nearly split him open, because against all odds, through loneliness and darkness and ancient fear, they had held the line. And because of that, there would always be new beginnings, always new songs sung under the ancient, benevolent gaze of the moon. And so the stories would continue, as they always had and always would, weaving through time like invisible threads, connecting every beating heart that ever loved, protected, and believed. And as the fire crackled and the stars spun slowly above, Thomas knew, without a doubt, that they were exactly where they were meant to be, not just surviving, but living, thriving, and belonging, forever part of the eternal story that stretched beyond whispering pines, beyond the borders of the known world, into a shimmering forever, where love, loyalty, and the fierce, unbreakable bond between kindred souls would always light the way.